Hello and welcome. My name is Lisa Upton. I'm the Senior Communications Advisor with the Climate Council. And this evening I'm joined by student strike organiser and author Daisy Jeffrey, Climate Councillor Professor Lesley Hughes and former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. I want to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders both past and present, and I extend this respect to the traditional owners of the land from where you are joining us. This evening we're talking about Daisy's book on hope. At the bottom of your window you will see a Q&A icon. You can click there and type a question. My fabulous colleagues behind the scenes will be filtering them through to me to ask a little bit later. Mr. Turnbull has about 20 minutes to spend with us before he has to attend another event, but we appreciate him dropping in and we'll continue on for another 20 minutes after he leaves. I want to begin with you, Daisy. You're in Year 12 with the HSC looming. You're studying at the Conservatorium High School, so you have lots of music commitments. You're one of the main organisers of the student strikes. Where exactly did you find the time to write on hope?
Well, during the summer holidays, last year I was very lucky to attend depending on which way you look at it, the conference, the 25th Conference of the Parties in Madrid. And it was a really devastating experience because it's a place where you're supposed to see the ambitions on climate action raised. And instead, essentially what we saw was a hold up, due to self-interest, politicians trying to further their own self-interests, as well as fossil fuel corporations. And I came back to Australia and I was pretty devastated. And I think all the young people who were there for the first time were as well. And so I think it wasn't so much about the lack of time I had to write it, more so how difficult it was to write a book about hope. And I think throughout writing the book, I was able to gain back, that motivation and that drive to keep working to make the world a better place. And what I'm hoping is that this book serves to empower and motivate others to do the same, and just prove that, no one is too small to make a difference.
I want to talk to you about your time in Madrid a little bit later, but let me take you back in time first. You were 7 years old when it became clear that you wanted to do something big in the world, and you had a grand plan and you spotted a minister in the government who thought might be able to help you. Can you tell us about that?
I think I saw Malcolm Turnbull on the TV once, and I decided he had to be the person to message about this idea my friends and I had to save the world. And it was this detailed letter about, foil, aluminium foil and chocolate and, washing machines and that sort of thing. And I think it might have gone a little bit all over the place, but we really thought we had, found the solution to the global waste crisis. And as Malcolm enlightened me, I was a little off the mark, but it was this, I think it was the start of knowing that I wanted to, push to continue to create things and try to make a better future for everyone. And of course, that happens like as a kid, you sort of deviate, from one cause to another. And then one day you're, trying to save the world and the next day you're playing fairies in the garden and whatnot. But I think that drive has stayed with me and a lot of other kids over the last decade or so. And here we are out in the world trying to make a change.
Malcolm Turnbull, I guess we're now picking up on a conversation that Daisy initiated with you a decade ago. You've written a blurb on the front of Daisy's book. You acknowledge her hope and her humour, but how important is her voice and what she has to say?
Well, it's vitally important. I think her generation are really putting their parents and grandparents' generation to shame in really, chastising us, rebuking us really for the failure to cut greenhouse gas emissions. We're going through this COVID crisis where the skepticism and I don't know, insouciance, nonchalance almost, of politicians has been confronted by the reality of biology. What is so frustrating is that the reality of the physics of global warming has not yet been able to get the political action that we need. I mean, it is, to be fair, and I mean, this is, I'm citing Greta Thunberg, who I know has been such an inspiration to Daisy's generation. It's really in America and Australia in particular where this issue of climate change, global warming has become an ideological issue of belief or values or identity. And, frankly, saying you believe or don't believe in global warming is as crazy as saying you believe or don't believe in gravity. I mean, if you don't believe in gravity and you jump off a big building, you'll find out that your disbelief is not well founded. But, because global warming doesn't appear yet to have the immediacy of the COVID crisis, we're taking medical and scientific advice on viruses, but we're not taking it on global warming.
Lesley, as the scientist on the panel, I'm sure you'd agree furiously with that.
Yes, well, it would be wonderful if the politicians who are listening actually very closely and very effectively at the moment in places like Australia to the scientists and following their advice and openly following their advice, it would be really wonderful if they had learnt some lessons during this period, and that when the COVID crisis is over, as we all hope it will be one day, they remember those lessons and perhaps pay us climate change scientists a little bit more attention. We've certainly been trying for more than 3 decades to get that attention.
This book is about hope, but Malcolm Turnbull, I think it's fair to say that Daisy and her fellow student strikers despair when they look at our federal parliament. Governments, including the one you led, have repeatedly failed to adopt a credible climate policy. Our Paris targets aren't even close to what the science says they should be. We're using dodgy accounting tricks rather than real emissions reductions. What do we need to do to change this?
Well, speaking for Australia, first thing I'll say is that the politics of this issue in Australia and America are similar, but I'll just talk about Australia. We have got one fundamental problem in this country on this issue, and that is the politics of the coalition of the Liberal and National parties. There is the right wing of the parties, supported by, branch members and people in the, community, have turned to treat this issue as an issue of belief or identity, which is nuts. That is completely nuts. And they are supported by the right-wing media, particularly the Murdoch media, which have been the really powerful opponents of taking action on climate change. I mean, you saw the way, Daisy mentions Matt Keane, the New South Wales Energy Minister, in her book. But you remember not so long ago, Matt gave an entirely unremarkable, it was a good speech, but it was an unremarkable speech about the need to take action to reduce emissions. And he was rewarded with a furious hit job from the Daily Telegraph, and Alan Jones and all those people. So that's the second part of it. And the third part of this toxic alliance, of course, is the fossil fuel sector. Now, they're the ones that I actually can understand. I can relate to the fact that if you've got a big coal mine, you want to sell coal. Okay, that's just hip pocket incentive. But the problem is that we have in our politics, and I have grappled with this for years inside the Liberal Party, is that we have ideology and idiocy where we need to have engineering and economics. I mean, look, you obviously can't just turn off all your coal-fired power stations tomorrow. And you've got to have a transition, you've got to have a plan, but the resistance to it is so furious and crazy and destructive. I mean, and the book I've just published recently, my memoir, A Bigger Picture, I described that over well over a decade. And the kind of tragic thing about it is, if you go back to 2007, in that election, Rudd was proposing an emissions trading scheme, and so was Howard. I mean, the people that designed Rudd's so-called left-wing Bolshevik emissions trading scheme, which I got, beaten up for supporting, was actually, it was Howard's scheme. The same people that were doing it for Rudd, led by Martin Parkinson, had been appointed to that role by Howard. So what we had was, we had a moment in time where a rational approach to global warming was more or less bipartisan, although there would have been differences, about pace and extent and all that stuff, to now where it's become this ideological issue, which is killing action on it.
You've been in the media a lot recently promoting your new book, as you mentioned, and I have heard you talk quite a bit about the influence of the Murdoch media, the far right of the Liberal Party. I'd like to put that aside for a moment and just ask you, when you look back at your time as Prime Minister, what would you do differently on climate if you had your time again?
Well, I'd love to have an easy answer there. I mean, in 2009, when I fought tooth and nail to get the emissions trading scheme through, people, a lot of people said, oh, I didn't bring the party room with me. I should have been more consultative. And I'm not agreeing. I mean, those criticisms are perhaps a bit overdone. But anyway, I do learn from experience. And so in 2017-18, with the National Energy Guarantee, it was so consultative. The cabinet was behind it. The majority of the party room was for it. It had the broadest support you could possibly imagine. We were still, as usual. I mean, throughout my political career, I've always been caught between critics on the left and the right-wing critics within the Liberal Party. So the thing about the right of the Liberal Party is that they would rather lose than have someone like me leading the party. That was fundamentally, that's the problem. It was the sort of burn the village to save the village. And again, I know this sounds quite irrational, and they are irrational, but that was always the challenge. And so I think with the NEG, I don't think we could be faulted in terms of consultativeness and all that sort of stuff. But still, there was this determination to blow the joint up, and that's what they did.
Daisy, what do you think about all of this? I mean, you describe in your book how you feel about how the government's going. Let's hear from you on this.
Look, I think with all, just looking at the past, with Australia's politics, our approach to climate across the board, across both Liberal and Labor, has been abysmal. Currently, it's abysmal. At the 25th Conference of the Parties in Madrid, it was beyond horrifying, and it was incredibly embarrassing to have to be there as an Australian and see our government try to work its way using credits, essentially trying to cheat its way through, around emission decline. And frankly, I'm not sure where I see the government going in future. And I haven't seen strong leadership. I haven't seen a strong approach. I haven't seen a party actually, work towards concrete climate action or climate justice. And as a young person, as an Australian, as someone who, perhaps wants to live in the world a little longer, I just find it incredibly disappointing. And the question, I think, now is, where do we go from here? And I, don't know what this government's approach is going to be after this crisis, after this pandemic passes. And I hope it is a good one. I also worry that they're going to use the economy as an excuse to ignore climate instead of acknowledging how interlinked those two concepts are. And so what we really need to see is from people who are current politicians, who are ex-politicians, and people across the board who are in influential positions, as well as your everyday Australians, including myself, we need to see this cohesive approach to tackling climate and actually working together. We need to move across these, ideological divides. I'm tired of it. I think everybody's tired of it, and the immaturity that has been shown by politicians across the board for the last 2 decades. And I think it's time to see some change.
Malcolm Turnbull, let me bring you back in there, because Daisy wants to see, everybody working on this issue, because we need everybody to work on it. Scott Morrison's doing very well in the polls right now. There's every chance this government will be re-elected. So let's assume that the government remains in power for the next 5 years. Those wanting climate action must build bridges. How do we do it?
Well, I think look, there are basically 2 ways. I think the coalition would. There's 2 ways you could overcome the opposition from the right. One is to get Lachlan Murdoch to change his mind and actually support climate action. You cannot underestimate the way News Corp operates. I mean, the Murdoch press is not media. It's not media in the sense of tradition. It's a political organisation devoted to political outcomes, which happens to employ a lot of journalists who do its work, right? So that is a huge obstacle. I'm just, this is politics in the raw. I hope it's not too confronting for your listeners. That's the truth. The other one is obviously electoral defeat, or the perception of electoral defeat. Here is the opportunity. This is basically the good news. The good news is that because of the decline in the cost of renewable energy, in particular photovoltaics, we are now in the position where we actually can have a zero emission energy sector. Obviously you've got to plan it, as I said, it isn't just like flicking a switch, but you've got to plan it. You can have a zero emission energy sector. That's why I've got Snowy Hydro 2.0 underway. That's the biggest pumped hydro scheme in the Southern Hemisphere. Absolutely critical, and more projects like that. So I also got the Battery of the Nation scheme underway in Tasmania, not as far advanced as Snowy 2, but the same idea. So you need to plan it, but we can have zero emission energy, and we can have cheaper energy. So this is the loopiness of the ideological, political, battles we're facing, is that those people who oppose rational approach to climate change are not just putting the planet at risk, they're also mean that we're paying more for electricity than we otherwise would. I mean, when I was the Environment Minister in 2007, when Daisy first wrote to me, in those days, solar and wind and so forth needed a lot of subsidies. They really did. They were much more expensive. That is not the case anymore. So we can actually, on this is a case where you can have your cake and eat it too. And so the argument should be, the political case should be for effectively a Green New Deal, that is no longer, green left wing hypothesis. It's really doable. If you had the chief executives of all the energy companies on this panel tonight, and you said to them, you've got to supply an extra, 1,000 megawatts of dispatchable power, none of them would say they'd build a new coal-fired power station. All of them would say, well, it'll be a combination of renewables plus storage. So the obstacles here, and this is where often people on the left overdo the sort of Marxist analysis, because they say, oh, this is all the money from the fossil fuel sector. The fossil fuel sector defends its interest. But the real problem is that something which should be a matter of fact and science and engineering has become turned into an issue of belief, identity, values. And I've grappled with values issues. Same-sex marriage, that's undoubtedly a values issue. That's a cultural issue. I get all that. You know, we got that legalised. But this global warming should no more be an issue of belief than the COVID virus, you know, or gravity.
Malcolm Turnbull, Daisy and the school strikers have not only mobilised students, they've mobilised adults, including over 2,000 businesses that supported them. On issues like marriage equality that you just mentioned, corporate Australia had an important voice. Should they be speaking out about a renewables-led recovery? Sure,
well, they should be. I absolutely believe they should be. And you'll find, actually, that business is very progressive on this. I mean, the BCA, which is the big end of town, I guess the biggest Australian companies, I don't think would disagree with very much of what I've said. I mean, it is, look, you can't argue with the facts. There is no question the cost per watt of electricity from solar PV has declined by so much that, you know, propositions and preconceptions a decade ago are completely and utterly out of date. You may as well be talking about, you know, the 19th century, right? They're irrelevant. The costs now mean that we can have zero emission electricity in this country, and in most countries, I might say, but certainly in Australia. We've got the means to do it, and we've got the means to do it cost effectively. And you know, the people that there's a great scene in my book which I relate, which is kind of sad. A bunch of the parliamentary colleagues, Nats and Liberals, came to see me and were arguing that we should build a new government-owned coal-fired power station. And I asked them why, and they said, oh, it would be cheaper. And I asked them a few questions. What are you assuming about the cost of coal and this and that and so forth? And they had no idea about that. And at the end of the meeting, they all filed out, and Bridget McKenzie, the deputy leader of the Nationals, was left. And she said to me, don't worry about the numbers. They don't care about the numbers, PM, it's religion. Now that was a very astute comment by Bridget, and therein lies the problem. That's the bit that I think all of us have trouble grappling with.
Malcolm Turnbull, I know you have to leave us pretty soon. We really appreciate your time, but I can't
Happy to be here.
go without offering Daisy the chance to ask you anything she would like to ask you, or to make any comment, Daisy, before Mr. Turnbull leaves.
I think it would be amiss of me not to thank you for your advocacy for climate action while in Parliament. What I would hope to see from you over the coming months, over the coming years, but particularly aggressively during this pandemic and following, is advocacy for climate action and climate justice. Because your voice as a former Prime Minister and as someone who has advocated for climate action in the past is incredibly important at this time, but also that you continue to lift up voices that would otherwise not be heard in the media in this conversation, particularly those voices that are directly impacted by climate change. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You can count on it, Daisy, and congratulations again on your book. And just to recap what I said on the front cover, Lisa read part of it. I said, Daisy has lost neither hope nor her wry good humour as she works to save our planet one strike at a time. So thank you, Daisy, and congratulations.
Thank you so much.
See ya.
Thank you. Daisy, you've mentioned it a couple of times, but I was really fascinated to read about your trip to Madrid late last year to the COP negotiations. And I think actually my favourite line, or one of them in the book, you're very funny, but I love the way you described it. Imagine 10 Bunnings warehouses strung together and you have the COP25, only without the snags and a hell of a lot fancier. Tell us a little bit about that. You received an award while you were there.
Yes, it wasn't a good award. It's kind of a civil society thing. So you have your main participants in the COP25, and then you have observers such as myself who usually come in with NGOs or possibly with government delegations, that sort of thing. And the fossil of the day is this civil society way of recognizing the country that is doing the worst on climate that day and the country that is doing the best. And I think that Australia won fossil of the day. I was handed a lump of coal, and I was standing alongside the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, who held in his hand, it was symbolizing a ray of light, the idea that Tuvalu was doing its part to take climate action. And it was really sad because, Tuvalu is very small, and Australia likes to think it is small in terms of what it can contribute to climate action, but we're enormous. Like, we are the third largest exporter of emissions in the world, behind Russia and Saudi Arabia. Like, that is nuts. And this idea that, this government and preceding governments continue to insinuate that we somehow don't have a massive part to play in this, in climate action and climate justice is ridiculous. And yes, so that day, I think Angus Taylor had given a spectacularly doozy speech, and we were awarded the fossil of the day that particular day.
Lesley, you follow these international negotiations very closely, and you were in Paris in 2015. Australia's reputation has taken a battering in recent years, hasn't it?
Yes, it certainly has. Though in Paris we were only awarded one Fossil of the Day award, and I was there for that. I think, coming back to the Madrid meeting that Daisy just mentioned, I think Australia got a total of about 6 awards on 6 different days and it's only 2 weeks long, so it's a big proportion. And I think the previous year to Paris, which was in Lima, we actually won the Colossal Fossil Award as well, which goes to the country that's won the most individual Fossil of the Days awards. So, there's certainly a pattern there. Certainly last year as well, there's a global index called the Climate Performance Index. I think Australia came 6th last out of 57, which was a bit better than the previous year when we were 3rd last, but was also rated 0 out of 100 for climate policy, presumably on the grounds that we didn't actually have one. So I totally agree with Daisy. When I was in Paris, I was totally ashamed of Australia's performance. Julie Bishop gave a speech there that I listened to about the need to keep mining coal to bring Indians out of poverty, etc., which is what won the Fossil of the Day award that day. The Prime Minister wasn't in Paris, wasn't in Madrid, but followed it up with a UN speech in New York, which every fact checker found a dearth of facts in there. So Australia has an absolute shameful record in terms of the international politics of climate change. And I felt for Daisy when she said she was embarrassed. I think we all felt that.
Daisy, I want to talk to you about just transition. It's one of the things the student strikers are demanding. Can you explain exactly what this is about and why this is personal for you?
I think I'll go with the personal first. So on my dad's side of the family, there's a history of coal mining, and my grandfather came out from the UK in the 70s as a coal mining engineer, and he'd worked to better, coal mines all over the world. It was his identity, it was, his experience. And then in the 80s, he got laid off. And, to have that kind of ripped away, and he was a father providing for 2 kids following a pretty dramatic divorce. And I think that actually hearing the stories from him, as well as hearing the impact it had on my dad and his sister, I think really impressed the importance of a just transition to me, because that idea that my granddad ended up having to become a cleaner, and just the idea that someone could be laid off and not provided a safe pathway to other opportunities and careers is unfair, it's unjust, and it's not something we should be having here in Australia or anywhere, really. And so a just transition, the words just transition has a not particularly good connotation, surrounding them. And the reason for that is that they've been so frequently tossed around by politicians and corporations and activists, the like, and not much has been done to actually follow through on those words. So the idea of a just transition is providing a safe pathway for workers out of a particular industry and into other industries and other jobs. And that's what we need for the fossil fuel industry as we move away from renewable energy. And, the thing is that people often, they get really worried because we have to, 20 years ago, it would have been a lot easier to have a slower pathway and like a slower cushioned transition. But because we've waited, because our governments and our politicians and corporations have waited so late and still aren't taking action, because of that, we now have a very small window to get people out of one particular industry, in this case, the fossil fuel industry, and connected industries into another. However, it must happen. It has to happen. And so I particularly advocate for that as, someone whose family has a history in the fossil fuel industry, also as a climate activist who recognises that workers in the fossil fuel industry are often unfairly targeted, I think, by the climate movement. It took the climate movement a while to try and build a bridge over that hostility between each other, and I think we're still working on that. And we need to advocate for workers to make sure that no one is left behind in this transition to renewable energy. However, we also need the actual transition to renewable energy to happen as well.
Lesley, how do you think we're going in Australia on this issue of just transition?
Look, as Daisy indicated, just transition is a great phrase and it's incredibly important. Unfortunately, because really neither side of politics has shown the capacity to have the plan, the just transition phrase has become rather cynically viewed as code for job losses. So we've got an uphill battle actually even using the phrase now, but the important thing really is not the phrase, it's actually, as Daisy said, having a plan. Unfortunately, neither side of politics really seems to have one.
Yes, yeah.
So we actually had a question from Jenny saying Germany did manage just transition without anybody losing a job, I believe. And I can confirm that with the black coal mines, nobody did lose a job. I was there last year having a look at the black coal mines and the brown lignite coal mines with the head of research at the Climate Council, Dr. Martin Rice. So Germany is in the process now of closing its brown lignite mines in order to meet its climate commitments. But Jenny asked, Daisy, should we invite the Germans here to talk about this so that it doesn't end up under the shadow of COVID-19?
Look, I think the Germans have done this transition pretty successfully. However, I think the first problem we face is getting this government to own up that it isn't really taking climate action at all. And so I think what we face at the moment is a government without a plan and without intentions to actually do better on climate. And I think, certainly Germans have done a good job, but we need the Australian people we need Australians to be pushing for climate action. We also need them to be advocating for a just transition. And I think certainly if we're asked about, a just transition, we can definitely point to Germany as a good indication of what can happen when we take care of workers and we make sure that no one's left behind.
Obviously, the student strikes, Daisy, were gaining a great deal of momentum. I think you had 80,000 people in the Domain on the 20th of September last year here in Sydney. We've had a question from one of our supporters saying, is there anything I can do from home? Obviously, the coronavirus has changed everything. Now that the strikes aren't possible, this person would like to know what they can do.
Yeah, so that's been something that the entire climate movement has been grappling with, youth included, although we've grown up with social media and we're fairly adept at it, which makes it, and that's how the entire strike movement grew, was organically through social media, which is quite incredible. And so we had 330,000 people turn out, onto the streets last September 20th. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was over 6 million across the world, across 2 dates, September 20th and 27th, respectively. And so it has been an enormous challenge for people to transition online to digital activism, but also trying to recognize that not everyone has the same capacity to deal with the level of drive that the climate movement had prior to the pandemic. However, we do also have to understand that the window for tackling climate change is still shrinking as fast as ever. And so just answering that question, I think your best bet is social media. So sharing articles, pointing to people who are giving out reliable information. And when I say people, I usually mean organizations, such as the IPCC, Greenpeace, that sort of thing. Encourage them to get behind petitions. Doesn't really often work out, but, email your MP, send them a letter. And that's, as individuals, that's what we can do during this time. And those of us who have a bit of a voice in the media will continue to speak out about the need for climate action and climate justice. And the thing is to remember that while your individual actions may seem small, that if a lot of other people are doing it, it's a tidal wave of change. And that's what we need right now.
I'm just looking here at a note that you wrote, Lesley, a handwritten note about 6 years ago. You say, the only way I can cope with all of this is to focus on what I can do, what I'm best at, and hope like hell that enough people are doing what they do best and can overcome. I have some very dark moments, but more than ever, I feel wrapped in a blanket of collective determination. Hope is a necessary emotion, but more than that, it must be our fundamental strategy to keep us going. Do you still feel like that? And how much hope have Daisy and the climate strikers provided you with?
Yes, I do feel like that. There's a quote that I like to often come up with, which is something from a 19th century Marxist Italian politician, Antonio Gramsci, who said, he talked about the tension between the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. And for me, that perfectly describes the brain of a climate change scientist and a lot of the activists. You struggle with those two emotions all of the time, and you have to be aware of both of them and balance them out. So yes, I do have hope for the future. I think Daisy wrote something really interesting in her book, which was actually quoting Bob Brown, because she went and sort of consulted with Bob Brown after the convoy to North Queensland and talked about hope. And Bob Brown said, well, look, hope is just a useless little 4-letter word unless it comes with action. And, as Daisy was just demonstrating, there's still, even in this time, there's lots of actions people can take. So it's unfair, as Daisy says in her book, for adults to pin all their hopes on a generation of young people who can't even vote yet. That is an unfair burden. So perhaps instead of hope, we should take inspiration and pride from them, as well as the shame involved in understanding that they've had to take this action.
It's interesting, isn't it? Daisy's book, Lesley, moves from her everyday focus on being a teenager and getting her homework done and dealing with her fat crush, her latest fat crush, as she called it. And then she's working on this really serious issue. Were you sort of struck by this book that moves between these two worlds?
Yes, look, absolutely. And I go through sort of similar emotions, I think, on an almost daily basis, because, I have a day job as an academic that's not purely climate change focused. And then I have my climate change activism work as well. And sometimes it feels like you're simultaneously living on two planets. But I also think that it's kind of important to have that balance sometimes, because if you focus 100% of the time on a topic like climate activism, it's really easy to burn out, and I see people burning out. And I guess if I had one piece of advice for Daisy, is that you can't focus on that all the time. You actually have to balance it out with other parts of your real life, and focus on your maths homework sometimes, because in some ways, while sometimes that feels like you're wasting your time, it's also the thing that's probably keeping you sane.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Daisy?
Yes, I think balance is really important. I mean, look, just for everyone watching this, this term is going to sound a bit naff, but it's a very real thing that impacts a lot of activists, and that's called activist guilt. And I've experienced that a fair bit, where you feel like every time you're actually not working to further the movement, you're sort of failing it by not dedicating enough time. And I really burned out last year after September 20th. And when I say burned out, I mean cried for 2 days straight, and ended up having to sit down with a bunch of my teachers and just kind of like talk it out. And it wasn't healthy, because I kept, I'd look at the news first thing every morning. I'd try to take in all the information I could. I'd be sending out emails all the way, like, on the bus into the city, into school. I'd go through my first couple of classes trying not to look at different workspaces and check what had to be done in terms of climate. And so it just wasn't healthy. I wasn't getting any sleep. I was always in meetings. And it's about distributing, redistributing your workload to make it healthy, and also finding those hobbies that can kind of keep you sane. And in my case, it has to be the HSC, which I hate. It sucks, but that's where we are. And so that's where balance has to come from. And I think balance is still something I'm working on. Even at the moment, like with this pandemic, everyone's mental health has been affected differently. And personally, mine has taken a bit of a hit. And just because for me, what I see is two existential crises running alongside each other. And, as an individual, I can only keep my family safe and keep myself, safe by staying inside and being, and just being sensible. And when it comes to the pandemic, and when it comes to climate, the entire climate movement, as I said, has had to pivot and find a different way of advocating for climate action and climate justice. And then, of course, there's HSC, which I need to be studying for more than I am. And that's been pretty difficult. And so I think, this idea of finding balance is something we're always going to have to strive for as individuals. But remember that, you are always, you can always reach out to someone. The more you talk with people about something, the more you inform yourself and then work to inform others, the easier and the lesser your workload is going to be, because it means that you have a bunch of people helping you to try and make the world a better place. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that. We need to wrap up now. Congratulations on your very important book, Daisy. Our next event will be held on the 27th of May, when we'll be talking about Damon Gameau's documentary 2040. Damon will join us for that conversation, along with the actor Yale Stone and Climate Council CEO Amanda McKenzie. We'll send out more information ahead of time. Thank you again very much, Daisy, and thanks to you, Lesley. Also, thank you to our community of generous regular givers. The Climate Council is an independent community-funded organisation, and we wouldn't be able to do this without you. Have a good evening.